I have represented Lyndon LaRouche since 1984, at which time he was directly targeted by the Department of Justice through its U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. Although there is a history of many years prior to that. And why is this case of Lyndon LaRouche of interest to you busy senators and representatives of color who have very busy agendas and a lot of work to be done for your own constituencies? Because political targeting is political targeting, whether it's on the basis of race, which we see constantly, and you deal with it in every day of your lives before you became elected representatives, and certainly now in a different way, or for other political reasons. Political advocacy of various kinds, if it is not of the sort that is favored and smiled upon by the federal government, becomes the object under the direction of the Justice Department of targeting and ultimately prosecution. And that's what happened in the case of Lyndon LaRouche, and it's what happened in many of the other cases, if not all of the other cases that you've been addressing this morning. I have probably the best way to demonstrate the government's venal behavior and the unconstitutional activities undertaken directed out of the criminal division of the Department of Justice is to show you their own documents and read to you their own words. And by way of history, I'd like to have number 1 put up on the screen. What you see before you is an FBI memorandum from the SAC, who is the special agent in charge of the New York field office of the FBI, to the director. It's dated I have a little difficulty seeing it, as I'm sure you are, but sometime in late 1969 or 1969.
Yeah, March 69.
And it requests authorization of the director to issue a false leaflet to stir up antagonisms between these various aspects of SDS. Now, I'm sure that's a tactic familiar to all of you, if in slightly different form. They want to disseminate this leaflet under false cover to various of these groups and stir up as much controversy between them, there hopefully undermining their ability to act in concert and getting them into faction fights, which would destroy their efficiency and cohesion. So in 1969 and 1970s, this was the kind of activity which was going on against the LaRouche political movement and many others, certain including people that you're well acquainted with personally. If we could move on to the next overlay. This is to the director, again from the SAC in New York, regarding, and the named subject, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche, Jr., also known as Lynn Marcus, as they suggest. This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And I have to stress something to you, all of you who are involved in the effort. You ask, what is our agenda? How do we fight against these wrongs, these evils emanating from the very center of our government? One of the difficulties is that you can't get the proofs. Where are the proofs? The proofs are hidden. It has taken us literally years, and I appreciate the kind words but my time is de minimis compared to the time of all of the others who have contributed to the effort to bring this case to the point at which it currently exists. An unsatisfactory point, but a point nonetheless where we have established evidence which clearly demonstrates to any honest and unbiased viewer the level of government misconduct that went into this entire witch trial of Lyndon LaRouche. We're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Is the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene? I think we all know what that means. So moving into the 80s, Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal and in social aspect and totally, particularly in context with the financial policies and the conditionalities imposed on the Third World in order to get monies from the World Bank, got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger, if you put up the next overlay, writes on his letterhead to William Webster, the director of the FBI. They had recently had a lovely social occasion together at a place called the Grove, where these powers associate and frolic around in various curious ways. And after that, he thanks, he appreciates having seen him there, and asks for the assistance of Bill Webster in dealing with the LaRouche menace. Here is, within the short period thereafter, Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI, I believe at the time, sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche is, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues. Why do we have these documents? Not because they gave them to us. They hid these from us. We finally, after years of fighting FOIA litigation cases, were able to peel off small pieces of this grapefruit. There's still a lot left down there. We haven't even got to the seeds yet. We're still working through the pulp. The common denominator between all of these cases is twofold. It's, as I said, political targeting, and it's the criminal division of the Justice Department. Can't imagine a more frightening thing than to realize that among the worst abuses of our constitutional rights as a people and for individuals, that they're being, in fact, planned and directed out of the very heart of the agency that's supposed to be protecting those rights. You probably also know from your own experiences with colleagues who have run afoul of the situations that have been discussed, that the first place they try is in the press. And then they try you in the courts once they've set the stage, once they've poisoned all the minds in the community against you. Then they haul you into court where you can't get a fair trial because the jurors who are sitting there have been told for days, months, years, or millennia what a bad person you are, what horrible offenses you've committed against the moral or social fabric of the community. Well, that's precisely what happened in the LaRouche case, probably more so than in any other case. This is an article. I'm only showing it to you for one reason, not because of the highlight, LaRouche jury would have voted not guilty, although that's true, and those come out of the words of the jury foreman who was interviewed. But in the first line of text, there is a, there are some very important words from the foreman. We would have acquitted everybody at this point, and that's based on prosecution evidence, said Foreman Dashowitz. There was too much question of government misconduct in what was happening to the LaRouche campaign. Government misconduct. Very seldom do you get a jury to see it, because the government fights you nail and tooth. They lie, they cover up evidence, they, in fact, deny information to their own agents so that the agent won't be in the position to have to intentionally not disclose it. These are common tactics, and that's what happened here. Fortunately, in our case, we were able to show enough of it to the jury so that the jury got the smell. However, the government wasn't about to quit, particularly having taken what was a serious public relations beating at that point in time. So they decided to switch forums, come down to a much more favorable forum, the most favorable forum, the Eastern District of Virginia, the so-called Rocket Docket, the home of almost every government agency and government contractor in the country, with a few other pockets here and there. Ramsey Clark, who has been with me, former Attorney General of the United States, who has been with me on all of the appeals, he joined the effort just after the sentencing of Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues in 1990. Recently, he wrote a letter to the Attorney General asking for a departmental review of the LaRouche case, and I'd like to read you some portions of his letter. He'll be here tomorrow to speak to you personally, but I'd like to leave you with the following words of Ramsey Clark. Dear Attorney General Reno, I've been an attorney in this case since shortly after the defendants were sentenced in January 1990 and appeared as counsel on appeal and on the subsequent motions and appeals in proceedings under 28 U.S. Code Section 2255 and Federal Rules Criminal Procedure Rule 33. I bring this matter to you directly because I believe it involves a broader range of deliberate and systematic misconduct and abuse of power over a longer period of time in an effort to destroy a political movement and leader than any other federal prosecution in my time or to my knowledge. 3 courts have now condemned the department's conduct in this prosecutorial campaign. The result has been a tragic miscarriage of justice, which at this time can only be corrected by an objective review and courageous action by the Department of Justice.
And I'll start and end with the case of Lyndon LaRouche and his co-defendants, not because it's the alpha and omega, although it's about as close as a case gets to the potential perfidy of justice, but because it shows how bad it can be, and yet it has, as so very, very few of these cases ever do, a positive side that we have to consider. I'd followed the earlier case in Boston, which by any measure was an extremely peculiar case, both in its charges, in its prosecution, and in its history. I knew the judge there as a fellow Texan. His brother, Page Keaton, had been dean of the law school where I started out down at the University of Texas. And he's one of the old school that doesn't like tricks, falsity, or injustice, and he became outraged with the prosecution. And did a lot. I can't tell you he did all that a judge could have done. I believe Odin will agree, though, he did a lot. There are not many judges who come through a political conditioning and process who have the courage to stand up to the power of the executive branch, to the FBI and others, and say the things that he did. And that's was almost an early end to a malicious prosecution. But in what was as complex and pervasive a utilization of law enforcement, prosecution, media, and non-governmental organizations focused on destroying an enemy. This case must be number one. There are some where the government itself may have done more and more wrongfully over a period of time. But the very networking and combination of federal, state, and local agencies, of executive and even some legislative and judicial branches, of major media and minor local media, and of influential lobbyist types, the ADL preeminently. This case takes the prize. The purpose can only be seen as destroying. It's more than a political movement. It's more than a political figure. It is those two. But it's a fertile engine of ideas, a common purpose of thinking and studying and analyzing to solve problems regardless of the impact on the status quo or on vested interests. It was a deliberate purpose to destroy that at any cost. In the LaRouche case, they're book people. I have to confess to the intellectual weakness. I find reading easier than thinking, so I read constantly, nearly blinded myself from too much reading. Got 15,000 books at home, read most of them, unfortunately. As you can tell, I haven't learned much, but I haven't stopped yet. These are book people. They had publishing houses going on, important publications, nonprofit stuff. The government comes in and these are just some of the peripheral things that Odin and others might not have explained to you. But these are what they were about: ideas, information, social change, meeting the needs of human people all over the world, humanity all over the world. We're going to have 1 billion more people before the end of this millennium, century, decade, and the vast majority, 80% of them, are going to have beautiful, darker skin, and they're going to live short lives of sickness, hunger, pain, ignorance, and violence unless we act radically. And these books have ideas. Some will work, some won't work, but they're ideas. They can be tested in the marketplace, as we used to say. And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses, and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know? We'll silence you. You'll have no books out there. And not only that, then they give they take people who are contributing and supposed to be paid back their their loans to the publisher and try to prosecute falsely on it. They put on witnesses to give false testimony. From the tens and tens of thousands of contributors and the thousands of people who gave loans, they come up with a baker's dozen, roughly, 13, 14, 15 people who got their feelings hurt, perhaps, and some who were mean-spirited enough to lie about it, and who didn't get their money back, although they were being paid back, because anybody can have a financial crunch where you can't pay back. Imagine what would happen to political campaigns in this country if you enforced laws strictly against those who are raising money like this by inquiring about all the people who gave money, whether they got what they wanted, what they expected, and whether they were misled about it or anything else. Nobody could run for office. I read the record. In addition to reading books, I read lots of records from trials. Absolutely no evidence to support a conviction there. If you take it all, if you exclude the parts that were false or venomous, there's not even a shell. But they had to say that this noble enterprise, agree or not with it, was corrupt. Corrupt. Have nothing to do with it. It's corrupt. Nobody respects financial or other corruption. Destroy them that way. They were put to trial without any chance to prepare their case. And they made a valiant effort and got consecutive sentences. Unbelievable. When the government will use that much force, that much energy, that much of its resources to destroy an idea or a movement or people. So this is one reason to look at what's happening here. I don't know much about it. I just see it from afar. I'm just a lawyer. But talk about getting heavy body blows. This Lyndon LaRouche and his supporters and people that work with him. Heavy body blows. 5 mean years in prison. Constantly worried about health and all the rest. Continuing prosecutions with unbelievable sentences, 77 years, 44 years, whatever it is, just, you can't say draconian. They're essentially psychological death sentences, if not physical death sentences, constantly coming at you. And here they are. And here we are.
But I've heard some things here in the past 2 days that really bother me tremendously about the United States Justice Department. We have heard tales of actually, I think, criminal and deliberate suppression of evidence by certain sections, what is that, OSI? Yes,
Special investigation.
in the Justice Department, and also what you call prosecutorial abuse by that particular section in the Justice Department and the Justice Department as a whole. And it really bothers me, and I'd like to know just what we can do specifically to ensure that this doesn't happen in the future.
But OSI ought to be abolished. It should never have been created. It's an instrument of hatred when there ought to be an end to it. It's not, however, the office that caused Waco or so many other things. We have a new and dangerous mentality. We have developed a police mentality that loves the SWAT team, the image of the SWAT team. I mean, they absolutely love it. They don't believe they're real policemen unless they can come in with a Rambo fire capacity and shoot up the place, you know. We worked hard at the idea that a police officer is a public servant. He is a civil servant. She has an obligation to serve the community, to reconcile, to prevent violence, not to cause violence, to solve problems, not to create problems.